Sarah's knees hit the floor before she could stop them. 10 years of blindness, and the first thing her eyes found was an empty wall. Her grandfather's portrait gone. Her mother's silver gone. The library her father bled to build, stripped to bare shelves. She pressed her hand flat against the floor, and she screamed not from grief, not from shock, but from the specific savage fury of a woman who finally understood that every word her husband had ever spoken to her had been a lie dressed as love. Thomas, her coachman, heard it from the courtyard. He did not move. He had been waiting for that sound for years. Subscribe and tell us what city are you listening from today. Part 1. The woman who could not see the truths. The embroidery hoop had been her cover for years. She held it the way she always had, needle moving in the slow, deliberate rhythm of a blind woman, finding comfort in texture and repetition. Anyone watching would have seen exactly what they expected to see. Lady Kingsley at her embroidery, patient and quiet the way blindness had made her patient and quiet whether she chose it or not. What they would not have seen was that her eyes were open, not wide, not obviously. She had spent the first 3 days back at Kingsley Manor practicing the precise degree of unfocus that looked like nothing. The absent gaze of a woman listening to the world rather than watching it. She had stood before Eleanor's mirror in London for a full hour before her departure, studying her own face, learning to wear her new sight the way you wore a coat you did not want anyone to notice. Present, unremarkable, drawing no attention to itself. She was watching the study door. Oliver had been inside for 40 minutes. The creak of his chair, the occasional shifting of papers, the particular silence of a man doing arithmetic that required concentration. Once the sound of the desk drawer opening and closing with the specific care of someone handling something he preferred not to disturb. When he came out, she was looking at her embroidery. "You should rest," he said, stopping in the doorway. The journey was long. "I'm not tired." He crossed to the side table and poured himself a brandy. She watched him from beneath her lashes, the set of his shoulders, the way his hand moved to the decanter with the ease of long habit. The slight tension across his back that had been there since she came home and had not entirely released. "Eleanor well. Very well. She sends her regards." He settled into the chair across from her, crossed his legs. The ease of a man in his own house with his wife across from him, doing her embroidery. Everything exactly as it had always been. Everything exactly as he believed it was. She set down the hoop. "I've been thinking I'd like to walk through the East Wing tomorrow. Refresh my memory of it." A pause. Small. Measured. "The floor is uneven near the far end," he said. "I wouldn't want you to catch your cane in a board. Then walk with me." Another pause. "Of course. Tomorrow then." She picked up the hoop again and let the silence settle between them, warm, domestic, entirely false. And she watched his face with the eyes he did not know she had, and she began very quietly to count the things that were wrong. It had started 3 weeks earlier, the night of the scream. She had been at the top of the main staircase when it came from the West Wing, high and sharp and cut off too fast. The way sounds were cut off not by their own ending, but by a door closing hard against them. Her hand tightened around the rosewood cane her father had given her. She stood and she listened still as water before a stone breaks its surface. Oliver's footsteps came from the west corridor, one set, heavy, measured. "Sarah." His voice was warm the way it always was. "You're up late." "I heard a scream." A pause. Brief. But she caught it the half-second of silence, where the truth sometimes lived before the words came to cover it. "A servant," he said. "Mary dropped the tea service, made quite a racket. I've already sent her to the kitchen. Poor girl burned her hand." She listened to all of it. Not just the words, the breath beneath them, the placement of his feet, the slight adjustment of his weight as he settled into the explanation. "Is she hurt badly?" "Mary? No, just rattled. You know how she is." She did know how Mary was. Mary Eames had been with them 4 years, 19 years old, the kind of girl who apologized for her own sneezing. What Sarah had heard from the West Wing was not the sound of a girl who had dropped a tray. "Come away from the stairs, darling," Oliver said. "The draft up here is dreadful." and Sarah came away from the stairs. Because that was what she did. That was what she had always done. The next morning she rose before Oliver was awake and went straight to the kitchen. "How is Mary's hand?" she asked Mrs. Pemberton without preamble. A pause. The kind with texture to it. Something careful being selected from among several possible responses. "Mary's hand, my lady. She burned it last night, dropping the tea tray." "Mary wasn't serving last evening, ma'am." Mrs. Pemberton's voice was entirely neutral. The voice of a woman who had managed a household through difficult seasons and had learned to be a vessel for whatever moved through them. She had the evening free. Her mother's been poorly. Mr. Kingsley gave her leave to go to the village after supper. The kitchen was warm and smelled of bread. Sarah stood very still in the doorway and absorbed this. Mary had not been in the house. There had been no dropped tray. Oliver had looked at his blind wife at the top of the stairs and built a story on the single assumption that she had no way to check it. He had looked at her blindness and seen not a woman who needed protection, but a closed room he could furnish however he liked. She thanked Mrs. Pemberton, returned to the entrance hall, stood alone with her cane in her hand, and understood for the first time in 10 years of marriage that she had been living inside someone else's description of the world. The question was not whether he had lied. The question was how long, and what the lies had been hiding. She had first heard the name Dr. Thomas Reed 6 weeks earlier at the autumn assembly in the village. A woman she did not know well. Mrs. Cartwright from the neighboring parish had pressed her hand and spoken quietly with the urgent sincerity of genuine helpfulness. "He's done extraordinary things in London. Cases the physicians here had given up entirely. I felt I simply ought to say something." Sarah had thanked her and filed the name away in the careful library of her memory, where it sat untouched for 6 weeks. The morning after her conversation with Mrs. Pemberton, she retrieved it. She did not tell Oliver. She told Thomas instead, steady, quiet Thomas, who had driven her through every season of this marriage without once offering an opinion he had not been asked for. He handed her up into the carriage with the unhurried steadiness of a man who had performed this action 1,000 times, and something in the way. He did it, the extra half-second of care. The slight pressure of his hand under hers told her what she had long suspected. Thomas knew the shape of things. He had always known. He simply had no language for telling a blind woman what her eyes could not yet confirm. She squeezed his hand once before she let go. He said nothing. He never did. But he drove her to the village without asking where she was going, and he waited with the horses without asking how long she would be, and when she came back to the carriage with a letter that needed posting, he posted it without reading the address aloud. That was Thomas. That had always been Thomas. The letter was addressed to Dr. Thomas Reed, London. She had dictated it privately to the vicar's daughter who could be relied upon for discretion, and she had it sealed and posted before she returned to the carriage. She told Oliver she had visited the lending library. This was true. She always did, which was precisely why she used it. Reed's response arrived 12 days later. He was not a man who traded in comfort. He said this plainly, and she respected him for it immediately. He had reviewed cases of her description before. Optic nerve damage following acute febrile illness. He could not offer certainty. But there had been developments in the past several years, significant ones, and he believed an examination was worthwhile. The vicar's daughter read it to her in the small parlor behind the church while rain moved against the windows. When the girl finished, Sarah sat with the meaning of it for a long moment. Not certainty. He had said it plainly, and that plainness felt in some way she could not quite articulate, like the first honest thing anyone had said to her in years. "Shall I write back, my lady?" "Yes," Sarah said. "Tell him to come here, not the Manor, the village inn. Tell him to expect me within the fortnight." She pressed 2 sovereigns into the girl's hand and asked for her discretion. She received it. She told Oliver about Reed on a Tuesday evening, the night he typically reviewed the estate accounts, which meant other things occupied his attention. She had chosen the timing deliberately. "I've arranged to see a physician," she said. "About my eyes." The sound of papers pausing. "A physician. Dr. Thomas Reed. He comes well recommended." I've never heard of him. He comes well recommended, she said again, with the pleasant immovability of a woman who had made a decision and was informing rather than consulting. The fire shifted. Oliver set his papers down with the care of a man arranging his thoughts alongside his documents. Sarah. The particular gentleness he used when he was about to tell her something for her own good. We've seen the best men in London. They were all quite clear. They said it might be permanent. Might. The chances of recovery after this length of time. Dr. Reed believes an examination is worthwhile. I have my own means to fund it. I am telling you as a courtesy. A long pause. Longer than the one at the top of the stairs. The pause of a man who has encountered something unexpected in territory he believed he controlled entirely. I think it may be unkind, he said carefully, to raise your hopes. My hopes are mine to manage. She heard him shift in his chair, the small contained movement of a man recalibrating. Of course, he said. The gentleness again slightly adjusted. Of course they are, darling. I only worry about you. You know that. I know, she said. She did know. The worry was real. She had never doubted the worry. But she was beginning to understand something she had been slow to see, that genuine worry and deliberate deception were not opposites. That they could live together in the same man, in the same marriage very comfortably. That a man could love you in the ways that cost him nothing, and take from you in the ways you could not see. She had trusted him because she had no eyes to see with. He had trusted her blindness because it was for his purposes the most convenient thing that had ever happened to him. Reed was thin, precise, and absolutely intolerant of softening things unnecessarily. He examined her over 2 hours at the village inn, in a room lit by 3 lamps positioned at his specific direction, asking questions between each test with the focused economy of a man building toward a conclusion he had not yet allowed himself to reach. Follow the light with your attention. Tell me what you perceive. Warmth. On the left side of my face. And now? The right. Yes. The sound of a note being made. Any differentiation. Any contrast. She concentrated. A difference between looking toward the window and looking toward the wall. But I've always had that. Light and dark only. No shapes. He set the pen down. Lady Kingsley. His voice was careful in the specific way of a man who had learned to carry significant news without letting it spill before he was ready. The responses I'm seeing, the sensitivity to directional light stimulus, these are not what I would expect if the damage were as complete as previous physicians assessed. A pause. There is a procedure, a corrective intervention. It carries risk. I will not minimize that. There is a chance of no change. There is a chance of further damage, though in your case, that risk is smaller than it might otherwise be. And there is a meaningful chance of significant recovery. Her hands were in her lap. She became aware of them, the way her fingers had tightened without her telling them to. How much recovery? I cannot promise full restoration. I cannot promise color or fine detail. What I can tell you is that several patients with presentations similar to yours have recovered enough vision to navigate the world with genuine independence. The fire in the grate, rain against the windows, the distant sound of men in the taproom below. How soon? Her voice was entirely steady. Within the month. The sooner the better. I'll need to arrange it privately, she said. My husband is concerned about my expectations. I would prefer to have the procedure completed before involving him further. A very brief pause. That is unusual. I understand. You would need to come to London. I have means of my own, Sarah said. And I have a coachman I trust completely. Another pause. She had the sense of being assessed, not unkindly. Then we will arrange it. She told Oliver she was visiting her cousin Eleanor in London. This was not entirely false. Eleanor lived in London, and she genuinely intended to visit. Eleanor had known about Reed from the beginning. Eleanor was 8 years her elder, had never married, and maintained opinions about Oliver Kingsley that she kept carefully contained in Sarah's presence, and could be trusted with a secret the way granite was trusted with weight. Thomas drove her to the station. Oliver came to see her off. He pressed her hand when he helped her to the carriage and said twice that she should send word immediately if she needed anything. He stood on the platform until the train moved or so, Eleanor told her afterward. Stood watching the train pull away, with the expression of a man watching something leave that he was not certain would return as he expected it. She sat in the compartment with her hands in her lap and listened to Eleanor describe the passing countryside in the plain, unvarnished way. Eleanor described everything. Not beautified, not curated, just the world as it actually was. "There's a village coming up," Eleanor said. "Looks like it's seen better days. The church steeple needs work." Sarah smiled and said nothing, and felt for the first time in years the particular sensation of moving toward something, rather than being managed inside it. The procedure took 3 hours. Afterward, she lay with her eyes bandaged, and Eleanor's hand in hers, and Reed told her they would know more in 3 days. She spent those 3 days in Eleanor's house in Mayfair, with the bandages on, and Eleanor reading to her from the newspapers, and asking no questions she had not been invited to answer. On the morning of the 3rd day, Reed came. He removed the bandages himself, layer by careful layer. Sarah sat very still and kept her eyes closed until he told her. She opened them. Light came in. Not the warm, undifferentiated impression she had lived inside for a decade. This was different. This had direction and shape. The window to her left was not the same as the lamp. To her right was not the same as the white plaster wall directly before her. A watercolor above the writing desk. A coastal scene, small boats on gray water. The edge of a chair. Eleanor's hands folded in her lap, with the stillness of someone trying very hard not to show how much they were hoping. Eleanor's face. She had not seen Eleanor's face in 10 years. Older than memory. Of course they were all older, time had moved without her witnessing it. Eleanor's hair almost entirely gray, now her eyes dark and sharp, and at this precise moment, very bright. "Can you see me?" "Yes." The word came out unsteady. She had not expected that, had expected to be prepared. "Yes, I can see you." Eleanor closed her eyes for exactly 1 second, then opened them. "Good," she said, entirely composed. "That's good then." Reed was watching her with the controlled attention of a man cataloging data in real time. "Tell me what you see, as specifically as you can," she told him. The wall, the painting, the lamp, Eleanor's face, the window. She turned toward it and felt something that was not quite emotion, but lived in the same neighborhood. The gray winter sky over Mayfair, and the tops of bare trees, and the roofline across the street. "This is a significant result," Reed said quietly. She was still looking out the window. At the bare winter trees she had not seen with her own eyes in 10 years. At the ordinary gray London sky. At the world unrated exactly as it was. She was thinking about a manor house 12 miles from a village. About a husband standing on a railway platform watching a train move away from him. About a scream from the West Wing, and a story about a dropped tray and a girl who had not been in the house that night. She was thinking about what she intended to do with the extraordinary, terrifying gift of being able to see again before she told a single soul that she had received it. She spent 2 more weeks in London. Eleanor understood without being told. Reed confirmed her vision was stabilizing, improving. She would not recover fine detail sharpness. Small print in poor light would remain difficult. Colors somewhat muted, but she could see faces across a room. She could read a document held in her own hands. She could see from across a corridor whether a painting was present or absent from a wall. She wrote to Oliver from Eleanor's house, gave him a date for her return, said nothing about her eyes. The morning before she left, she sat in Eleanor's parlor with tea she did not drink, and Eleanor sat across from her with the specific quality of not speaking that meant she had things to say and was waiting to be invited. "Say it," Sarah said. "Be prepared," Eleanor said carefully, "for it to be worse than you expect. You've been told one version of your life for 10 years. You are going home now with eyes that work, and no one knows it. That is a great deal of power, Sarah. Make sure you're steady before you walk through that door." Sarah considered this. "I'm steady. I know you are." Eleanor looked at her directly. I also know there is a difference between suspecting you've been lied to and seeing the evidence with your own eyes. Those are not the same experience. Sarah looked out the window at the London street, at people moving through their days in full view of the world. She had not been in full view of anything for 10 years. She had been inside the story someone else was telling about her. She was going home now, and for the first time, she would be the one watching. Oliver met her at the station. She saw him, truly saw him with working eyes for the first time in a decade, and felt the complicated vertigo of recognizing someone you know entirely, and not at all. Older as they were, all older. Lines at the corners of his eyes she had not known were there. A slight forward lean, she did not remember the lean of a man who carried something heavier than he showed. He reached for her, and she let him take her arm, the way she always had. She looked at his face while he guided her toward the carriage, and he did not know she was looking. He spoke warmly about Eleanor, about the journey, about the improvement in the weather. He said the manor was just as she had left it. She said she had missed him, and she watched his face while she said it, watched it with the eyes she had not told him about, and she read what was there. Not a villain's face, not cold calculation. Something more complicated and harder to hate, the face of a man who had been managing something for so long that it had become invisible to him, as natural and unremarkable as breathing. The carriage moved through the countryside toward the manor. She sat across from him and watched the passing landscape, the fields, the tree lines, the winter sky pale gold in the west, and she thought, I have been blind in every possible sense of that word. But that is finished now. Kingsley Manor appeared at the end of the drive. She looked at it with her own eyes. The formal garden. Oliver had described to her in seasons, magnificent in summer, elegant in winter, was overgrown in the way of several neglected years. Not one. The stone of the east wing carried weathering she did not recognize from memory. A shutter on the upper floor hung broken at its hinge. She said nothing. Oliver helped her down from the carriage. She walked with him through the front doors and into the entrance hall, and she looked, her face arranged in the expression of a woman navigating by memory and sound at the hall she had not truly seen in 10 years. Her grandfather's portrait was gone. The wall above the mantel held a landscape she did not recognize. Pleasant adequately executed, the kind of painting that filled a space without drawing attention to what it had replaced. The console table along the north wall, where her mother's silver candlesticks had always stood, held a different set entirely. Brass, not silver, not her mother's. It's good to be home, she said. Her voice did not shake. Oliver said he would have tea sent to the sitting room and went toward the study. She stood alone in the entrance hall and looked at the wall where her grandfather was not, and she understood with a sudden total clarity what the next chapter of her life was going to require. Not grief, not confrontation, not yet. Evidence. She straightened her back, arranged her expression, and walked toward the sitting room with the familiar unhurried confidence of a woman who had memorized every inch of this route. She sat by the window, picked up her embroidery, and began to count methodically, completely, without flinching, everything that was missing from the home she had been told was thriving. The list was longer than she had prepared herself for, and she had barely begun. The embroidery hoop had been her cover for years. She held it the way she always had, needle moving in the slow, contemplative rhythm of a blind woman, finding comfort in texture and repetition. Anyone watching would have seen exactly what they expected to see. Lady Kingsley at her embroidery, patient and quiet the way she had always been patient and quiet, the way blindness had made her patient and quiet, whether she chose it or not. What they would not have seen was that her eyes were open, not wide, not obviously. She had spent the first 3 days back at Kingsley Manor practicing the precise degree of unfocus that looked like nothing like the absent gaze of a woman listening to the world rather than watching it. She had stood before Eleanor's mirror in London for an hour before her departure, studying her own face, learning to wear her new sight, the way you wore a coat. You did not want anyone to notice, present, but unremarkable, entirely ordinary, drawing no attention to itself. She was watching the study door. Oliver had been inside for 40 minutes. She had counted. The creak of his chair, the occasional shifting of papers, the particular silence of a man doing arithmetic that required concentration. Once the sound of the drawer in his desk opening and closing, with the specific care of someone handling something he did not want to disturb unnecessarily. When he came out, she was looking at her embroidery. "You should rest," he said, stopping in the doorway. "The journey was long." "I'm not tired." He crossed to the side table and poured himself a brandy. She watched him from beneath her lashes, watched the set of his shoulders, the way his hand moved to the decanter with the ease of long habit, the slight tension across his back that had been there since she came home and had not entirely released. "Eleanor, well. Very well. She sends her regards." He settled into the chair across from her, crossed his legs. The ease of a man in his own house in his own sitting room, with his wife across from him, doing her embroidery, everything exactly as it had always been. Everything exactly as he believed it was. "I've been thinking," Sarah said, keeping her voice conversational, "that I would like to walk through the house tomorrow, the east wing. I haven't been through that corridor in some time, and I want to refresh my memory of it." A pause. "Small enough to miss if you weren't measuring them." "The East Wing corridor is in some disrepair," he said. "The floor is uneven near the far end. I wouldn't want you to catch your cane in a board." "Then you can walk with me." Another pause. "Of course," he said. "Of course. Tomorrow, then." She looked at the embroidery in her lap and let the silence settle between them, warm and domestic and entirely false. She began with what she could confirm herself without assistance, without asking questions that might reveal what she was doing. Every morning before Oliver was awake, she moved through the manor alone. She carried her cane for appearance and for the comfort of its familiar weight in her hand, but she did not need it the way she once had. She needed it the way an actor needs a prop to play the role that had kept her safe this far and would keep her safe a little longer. The library was the first real proof. Oliver had described it to her many times over the years, always with a particular fondness. The double rows of her father's collection. The Hartwell Library, that had been one of the finest in the county, assembled over 3 generations of men with more appetite for reading than their neighbors gave them credit for. He had told her about rearranging it, about the acquisition of additional volumes in the legal and agricultural sections, about the new shelving along the north wall. She stood in the library, in the gray light of an early morning, and looked at shelves that were more than half empty. Not the empty of rearrangement, not the empty of a collection in transition. The empty of removal, of absence. The specific quality of shelves that had held many things for a very long time, and now held far fewer, the pale outlines of where books had stood for decades visible in the slight variation of color on the wood behind them, ghosts of what had been there. Her father's library. 3 generations of collecting. Gone in, she did not know precisely how long. That was part of what she did not yet know. She stood in the library doorway and breathed through it and made herself count. She counted the empty spaces, the way Reed had taught her to catalog her vision precisely without emotion, just inventory. 40% of the shelves were at less than half capacity. Perhaps more. Then she moved to the drawing room. The painting above the mantel in the drawing room. A landscape that had replaced her grandfather's portrait in the entrance hall. She had noted it on her first evening home, catalogued it quietly, and moved on. But now she stopped and actually looked at it. Not a family portrait. Not something of particular value from the Hartwell collection, as far as she could tell. A pleasant landscape of no particular distinction, professionally executed, the kind of painting that filled a space adequately without drawing attention to what it had replaced. She turned to the walls on either side. 2 smaller pieces she recognized from the upstairs corridor. She recognized them because she had touched them years ago, learning the frames by feel, the slight ridge of the carved wood, the difference in depth between one frame and another. They had been moved down from the corridor to fill spaces here she now understood, shuffled like cards to cover the gaps. She went to the silver cabinet in the dining room. She had spent an afternoon years ago with Mrs. Pemberton going through the silver for an inventory, the complete Hartwell silver service, 63 pieces handed down through her mother's side and brought to the marriage as part of her dowry. She had held each piece, memorized the weight and shape of it. the soup tureen with the slightly heavy base, the fish knives with the mother-of-pearl handles, the pair of tall candlesticks her mother had bought in Bath the summer before Sarah was born. She opened the silver cabinet and counted. 31 pieces. She counted again. 31. She closed the cabinet and stood with her hand on the wood and breathed very carefully in and out, the way you breathed when something large had arrived and you needed to receive it without letting it knock you sideways. 32 pieces of silver were gone. She went to breakfast. Oliver was already at the table when she came in, the newspaper open beside his coffee cup, the comfortable order of a man whose mornings had a reliable shape. She took her seat, accepted the coffee that Mrs. Pemberton brought, and said pleasantly, "I slept very well." "Good. The London air never agrees with me the way the country does." He turned a page of the newspaper. "Eleanor's house is comfortable enough, but it always feels close. Too many people, too much noise. She likes the city." She would. A small quality to his voice, not quite dismissal, but in its general direction. He had never found Eleanor's opinions entirely comfortable. Eleanor's opinions had a tendency to be specific and accurate, which Oliver had always treated as a minor character flaw. Sarah poured her coffee and said in the same pleasant conversational tone, "I was thinking of writing to Mr. Fairfield this week, about the Hartwell accounts." The newspaper page did not turn. "Fairfield," Oliver said. "Daniel Fairfield, father's solicitor. He managed the Hartwell estate before our marriage, and I believe he still handles certain residual matters." She added cream to her coffee. "I've been meaning to ask him about a bequest. Something father mentioned before he passed that I never confirmed was properly executed." The newspaper came down. Not dramatically, Oliver was not a dramatic man, but it came down, and he looked at her across the table with an expression she could now see clearly, an expression she had previously only been able to hear the shape of in the quality of his voice. He was not alarmed. Not quite. But he was attentive in a way that was different from his ordinary attentiveness, focused the way a man focused when something required careful handling. "I wasn't aware of a bequest. It was a small matter, probably nothing, but I should confirm it." She smiled at him over her coffee cup. The smile she had always given him, placid, unhurried, the smile of a woman who trusted him entirely. She had spent years building that smile. It was the most useful thing blindness had ever given her. "You know how it is with father's affairs. He was careful to a fault, and I'd hate to find something had been overlooked. If you'd like," Oliver said, "I can write to Fairfield myself, save you the trouble." "No trouble at all." She picked up her own section of the newspaper, turning to hold it at the angle she had always used when she couldn't read it, the angle of a woman who liked the feel of the paper in her hands. "I enjoy the correspondence. It gives me something to do." A beat. 2 beats. "Of course," he said, and returned to his newspaper. But the quality of his attention had changed. She could feel it across the table, like a change in temperature, not hostile, not panicked, but tracking her now with a carefulness that had not been there before. The carefulness of a man who had been very comfortable and had just felt the ground shift slightly beneath him. Good, she thought. Let him track. Let him wonder what she knew and what she didn't. She had lived inside that particular uncertainty for 10 years. It was his turn to sit with it for a while. She wrote to Daniel Fairfield that afternoon in the small writing room off the library that had always been designated as hers, her private correspondence room, which Oliver visited only when invited a domestic convention she had never particularly valued before and now valued considerably. She wrote the letter herself. Her handwriting, she discovered, was still perfectly legible when she could see the page, slightly uncertain in its line the way handwriting was when it had not been practiced in a decade, but readable. She addressed it to Fairfield's office in the city, and sealed it, and gave it to Thomas for the post, without mentioning it to anyone else. In the letter, she asked 3 things. She asked for a complete accounting of the Hartwell estate assets as they had stood at the time of her marriage. She asked for the terms of the marriage settlement, as Fairfield had drawn it up, specifically, the provisions regarding her personal inheritance and her right of access to the Hartwell accounts. And she asked last with the careful casualness of a woman making polite conversation on paper whether Fairfield had been contacted at any point in the past 10 years regarding the sale of assets from the Hartwell estate, and if so, by whom and under what authority. She sealed the letter. She had not until that moment entirely understood what she was doing. She had been operating on instinct, the same instinct that had sent her to Dr. Reed, that had stood her at the top of the stairs after the scream that had made her spend 3 days in London practicing how to wear her sight like a secret. But sealing that letter and handing it to Thomas, she understood clearly for the first time what the next chapter of her life was going to require. Evidence. Not feeling. Not suspicion. Not the accumulated weight of pauses and shifted paperwork and gone silver and empty library shelves. Evidence. The kind that could stand in a room and be examined by other people and hold its shape under examination. She was going to need help. Daniel Fairfield arrived 3 weeks later. She had not expected him to come in person. She had thought a written response, perhaps a request for clarification. But Fairfield was 72 years old and had been her father's solicitor for 40 years before that, and apparently there were things he preferred to say in a room rather than on paper. She received him in the library. Oliver was in the village. She had arranged the visit for a day when he had business there, timed with the specificity of a woman who had learned over years to work within the spaces other people left open. Mrs. Pemberton brought tea. Fairfield settled into the chair across from her with the careful movements of an old man who had learned to protect his joints, and looked at her with the sharp, unhurried attention of someone who had been holding on to something for a very long time. "Lady Kingsley," he said, "I was relieved to receive your letter." That was not what she had expected him to say. Relieved. "I have wondered," Fairfield said carefully, "more than once over the past several years, whether I ought to contact you independently of that is—" He stopped, folded his hands on his knee, started again with the precision of a man choosing words the way a surgeon chose instruments. "Your father was a meticulous man. Everything properly drawn up, properly witnessed. The marriage settlement was among the most thoroughly constructed documents I have produced in 40 years of practice." A pause. "The provisions regarding your personal inheritance were explicit. Your father wanted to be very certain that the Hartwell estate assets remained accessible to you, not merely nominally, but actually. He had particular views on the subject of women's property and marriage, views that were a careful flicker of something that might have been dry humor, somewhat ahead of the general practice of the time." "I know," Sarah said. Her father had argued with her about this earnestly and at length in the last year of his life. She had told him she trusted Oliver. He had told her that trust was not a legal document. She had laughed. What did the settlement specify? Fairfield opened the leather case he had brought. "The Hartwell properties, the 300 acres, the house, the income from the Eastern tenant farms were held in a protected trust under your name. In the event of your marriage, the income was to pass to your household, but the principal assets were to remain yours and could not be sold, leased, or transferred without your explicit written consent and my countersignature as trustee." He looked at her over his papers. No sale of Hartwell property could be legally executed without both. She absorbed this carefully. "And has any such sale occurred?" Fairfield's hands were very still on the papers in his lap. 2 sales of Hartwell land occurred in 1812 and 1814 respectively. A further 3 occurred between 1815 and 1816. In each case, the documentation presented to the county recorder's office bore a signature identified as yours and my countersignature. The room was very quiet. "Fairfield," she said slowly, "did you countersign those documents?" The old man looked at her with an expression she recognized as something between professional distress and personal relief. The expression of someone who had been carrying a weight alone and had just been offered help carrying it. "I did not," he said. "I have never countersigned any document relating to the sale of Hartwell property. I was not consulted. I was not contacted." A beat. "When I became aware of the county recordings, I confess I did not immediately know how to proceed. Your husband presented the sales as properly executed. The signatures were convincing. And you had never written to me directly, had never raised any concern, and I understood that your health, your vision—" He stopped again, started again more carefully. "I did not know how much you were aware of. and I was not certain, given the nature of the situation, whether approaching you directly was appropriate or whether it might cause difficulties. She sat with this for a moment. The weight of what he was telling her, the specific shape of it. Her signature. Forged. On 5 separate documents. On 5 separate sales of land that had been her father's land. Her father's careful provision for her sold without her knowledge or consent, while she sat in this house unable to see, and trusting the man who had taken everything to describe the world to her as it was not. "How much land?" she asked. Her voice was steady. She was going to be proud of that later. At this precise moment, she was simply focused on remaining in her chair. "Approximately 140 acres, Fairfield said. In total. Nearly half the Hartwell estate, nearly half what her father had left her. And the silver," she said. "The library. The family portraits." Fairfield's expression shifted. "The library and the portraits would not fall under my purview. Those are personal property rather than estate property, and the provisions of the settlement are somewhat less clear on personal assets. But," he paused, "I have made certain inquiries since receiving your letter. There are records at the auction house in the city of significant sales of books and artwork described as originating from an estate in this county. The dates correspond to several of them correspond to years when I know Mr. Kingsley traveled to the city on what was described to me as estate business." She stood up. Not dramatically. She simply needed to stand. She walked to the window and stood with her back to Fairfield and looked out at the overgrown formal garden and let the full weight of the last 10 years rearrange itself inside her, not into grief, not yet, but into something colder and harder and more useful than grief. He had sold her father's land. He had sold the library her grandfather built. He had sold her mother's silver candlesticks and her grandfather's portrait and the fish knives with the mother-of-pearl handles that she had memorized by touch because she could not see them. He had sold it all. And he had stood in front of her day after day, year after year, and described for her a world that was intact and beautiful and thriving. He had told her the gardens were lovely. He had told her the estate was well managed. He had given her a story to live inside because she could not see through it to the reality on the other side. And she had thanked him. She had taken his arm and let him guide her and thanked him for describing the world. She turned back from the window. "What would I need?" she said with a precision that surprised even herself, "to pursue legal recovery of the Hartwell assets." Fairfield sat up slightly straighter. Something in his bearing shifted the relief of an old man who had been waiting for the right question from the right person who had carried the weight of what he knew alone for too long and was finally being asked to put it down and do something useful with it. "Documentation," he said. "The originals of the forged instruments, if we can obtain them from the county recorder. An independent expert examination of the signatures. My own sworn testimony as the legitimate trustee. And," he paused, "ideally a complete accounting of all Hartwell assets as of your marriage date versus their current state, which I can assemble from my own records." "How long?" "To assemble the documentation, a matter of weeks. To pursue the matter legally." He hesitated longer. "And the process would not be quiet. These things rarely are." She nodded, returned to her chair, picked up her teacup. "Prepare the documentation," she said. "All of it. I'll come to the city when it's ready." Fairfield looked at her for a long moment. Then he said carefully, "Lady Kingsley, I want to be certain of something before we proceed. Are you quite sure of what you are doing? Once this begins, Mr. Fairfield." She met his eyes. She could meet eyes again now. She had not fully appreciated until this week what it meant to be able to look directly at someone while you spoke to them, to read their face as your words landed. "I spent 10 years being told what the world looked like by a man who was selling it, I am quite sure." The old solicitor held her gaze for one more second. Then he inclined his head with the formal respect of a man of his generation, the particular nod that meant not deference, but genuine acknowledgement. "Very well," he said. "I will be ready within the month." She saw Oliver differently now. This was the part that surprised her. Not the evidence, not the missing land, and the forged signatures, and the empty shelves. Those were terrible, but they were comprehensible. What surprised her was how differently she saw him now that she could actually see him. He was not the man she had imagined. He was not a schemer with cold eyes and calculated cruelties. He was something harder to hate and harder to forgive, a man who had started with a problem and solved it in the way that cost him the least, and had then lived with the solution so long that it had become simply the shape of his life. She watched him across the dinner table and saw it happening in real time, the small negotiations he made with himself, the way he watched her with a care that was absolutely genuine and absolutely in service of his own peace of mind. He did care about her. She did not doubt it. He worried when she moved too quickly through a room. He made sure the household was warm enough. He sat with her in the evenings and read to her from the newspapers, and the reading was real attention, real consideration, not performance. And he had forged her signature on 5 legal documents and sold half her father's land. Both things were true. That was the hardest part. If he had been purely mercenary, purely cold, she could have arranged her feelings around him more neatly. But he was a man who had loved her in the ways that were convenient to him, and had stolen from her in the ways he could tell himself she would never know about, and had managed to live with both of those things by keeping them carefully separate in his own mind. One evening in the second week after Fairfield's visit, she tested him. She came into the drawing room where he was reading and said, sitting in her usual chair, "I was thinking about Mother's candlesticks today, the ones she brought from Bath. I wanted to have them polished, but I couldn't remember. Did we move them from the dining room? I couldn't find them by the silver cabinet." A pause. "I believe Mrs. Pemberton may have moved them for cleaning," he said, not missing a beat, not even a half beat. "I'll ask her." The ease of it. The absolute practiced ease. The way the lie was already shaped and ready before the sentence was finished. The way a man reached for something that was simply there within reach, because he had reached for it so many times before that his hand knew the way without direction. She nodded and said that would be fine. He asked her tomorrow whether Mrs. Pemberton had located them. She said yes, thank you. He said good, he was glad. And they both moved forward into the evening, and Sarah sat with her embroidery, and she understood something she had not entirely understood before, that the lying had not been a decision. It had been an evolution, each small untruth building on the last, each convenient omission making the next one simpler, until the truth of what he had done and the lie of how he had described it had become so thoroughly braided together that he might not on any given day have been able to identify exactly where one ended and the other began. She did not find this comforting, but she found it strangely clarifying. Fairfield's report arrived in 2 parts. The first part came by post addressed to her directly, a summary of the documentation he had assembled. Careful and thorough, the work of a man who took his responsibility as a trustee very seriously, and was she suspected experiencing something close to professional outrage at what the investigation had revealed. The second part came with Fairfield himself, 3 weeks later, on a morning when Oliver had ridden to visit the Carver estate on the neighboring property. She received him in the writing room. He laid the documents on the desk between them, 5 forged instruments. The county recorder's copies obtained through a colleague's assistance, and Fairfield's own standing as the estate's legitimate trustee. Side by side with examples of her actual signature letters she had written before her blindness, which Fairfield had obtained from her father's correspondence file with her permission, the difference was visible once you knew to look. Not gross, not obvious to the casual observer. But there. The forged signature was slightly more compressed, the loops of the capital S slightly different in proportion. The work of someone who had studied her handwriting carefully and reproduced it skillfully, but not perfectly. The work of someone who had had access to her correspondence for years. "There is more," Fairfield said. He was a careful man, but there was something in his voice that had a quality of suppressed indignation, the voice of a man of principle who had been made by association part of something he found deeply objectionable. The mortgage. She looked at him. "Against the manor itself," he said. "Mr. Kingsley took a substantial mortgage against Kingsley Manor in 1814. I became aware of this only in the past week in the course of the broader investigation." He paused. "The manor is not in a comfortable position. The debt is significant. It is, I believe, the primary reason for the asset sales they were servicing the interest." She sat very still. The manor is mortgaged. Yes. To whom? A private lending institution in the city. The terms are not favorable. She put her hands flat on the desk and looked at them. Her own hands plainly visible to her, the lines across the knuckles, the slight callus from the cane handle, the ink stain on her right index finger from the letter to Fairfield 3 weeks ago. Her own hands. He had sold her father's land to pay the interest on a debt he had taken against a house that was at least partly hers. He had kept the manor from foreclosure, kept their life intact. The servants employed the household running by, slowly, methodically dismantling everything her family had built and feeding it piece by piece into a debt she had known nothing about. And he had described it to her as thriving. Every season, every year, beautiful gardens, fine library, secure estate, nothing to worry about. She had trusted him because she had no eyes to see with. He had trusted her blindness because it was for his purposes the most convenient thing that had ever happened to him. The rage came then finally. She had been keeping it at a distance, managing it, filing it under evidence and documentation and practical next steps. But it came now quiet and complete and very deep. The kind of rage that was not hot but cold, the kind you could carry without it carrying you, the kind that clarified rather than obscured. She looked at Fairfield across the desk. "What do I need to do," she said, "to begin the formal process?" "I've prepared an initial petition," he said. He slid a document across the desk, 4 pages, close-written, precise. "It sets out the basis for recovery of the Hartwell assets on grounds of the forged instruments. It also requests an independent audit of all estate finances over the past 10 years. A pause. "I want to be clear about what this means in practice. When this petition is filed, Mr. Kingsley will be informed. He will have the opportunity to respond. The process will be visible. People will know." She picked up the document. "Read it." Actually read it, her own eyes moving across the words, absorbing the legal language. The specific formal structure of a document that was asking a court to acknowledge that a blind woman had been robbed by the man who described the world to her. She read it to the end and set it down. "Oliver will deny it," she said, "almost certainly. He'll say he was protecting me, that the decisions were made in my interests, that I had tacitly approved. Yes, and we will have the forged instruments and my sworn testimony and the independent accounting." Fairfield met her eyes without flinching. "Lady Kingsley, your father built that settlement to protect you. It is in my professional opinion sound. What was done was a clear violation of its terms. The question is only whether you are prepared for what the pursuit of it will require." She thought of her grandfather's portrait gone from above the mantel. She thought of her mother's candlesticks gone from the silver cabinet. She thought of 32 missing pieces of silver, and a library emptied of 3 generations of books, and 140 acres of her father's land sold to cover a debt she had never been told about. She thought of Oliver saying easily, with the warmth of a man who believed himself kind, "The gardens are beautiful this summer, Sarah. The estate is thriving. There is nothing to worry about." She picked up the pen that Fairfield had set on the desk beside the inkwell. "Tell me where to sign," she said, and then she stopped. Because she did not need anyone to tell her where to sign anymore. She could see the signature line herself there at the bottom of the final page, a clear black line waiting for her name. She signed it. Her own hand, her own signature. The compressed loops and the particular proportion of the capital letters that were hers and no one else's. The signature that someone had studied and practiced and replicated and used to take everything her father had left her. She signed it and handed it back and sat quietly while Fairfield blotted it and checked the date and returned it to his leather case with the careful movements of a man who had just witnessed something he would remember for the rest of his life. "I will file this on Thursday," he said. "Thank you, Mr. Fairfield." She rose. "For coming, for waiting." The old man stood slowly and looked at her with the expression of someone who had something else to say and was deciding whether to say it. "Your father," he said finally, "would have been he was a very particular man, your father. He didn't give compliments easily." A pause. "I think he would have found you adequate to the moment." From Edward Hartwell's solicitor, she understood that was as close to extraordinary as the language allowed. She walked him to the door herself. Oliver came home from the Carver estate at 4 in the afternoon. She was in the sitting room when he arrived, and she heard his voice in the hall greeting Thomas about the horses, and then his step in the corridor, and then the sitting room door. He stopped in the doorway. Something in her bearing had shifted. She was not aware of it until she saw it register on his face, a slight adjustment, a recalibration. Nothing he could point to, nothing specific. But the slight quality of wrongness that a person carried when something large had changed inside them, and the outside had not quite caught up yet. "Good afternoon," she said. "How were the Carvers?" "Well enough." He stayed in the doorway a moment longer than he ordinarily would have. "You had a visitor, not a question." Mrs. Pemberton, she guessed. Or Thomas. Not betrayal, simply the ordinary intelligence of a household servant's noticed things. She had always known this. She had counted on it, in fact. "Mr. Fairfield," she said pleasantly. "He had some paperwork regarding Father's estate, a small residual matter." Oliver was quiet. "I didn't know he was coming," he said. "I wasn't sure he would," she said. "You know how he is. He prefers to handle things in person when he can." She set down her embroidery. "Are you hungry? I asked Mrs. Pemberton to hold dinner until you were back." She watched him read her face. Watched him search it for, she didn't know exactly. Evidence, she supposed. The same thing she had been searching for in his. And she watched him find the same thing she had been giving him for 3 weeks. The composed, familiar face of his blind wife. Patient and quiet and entirely legible and completely opaque. "Dinner," he said. "Yes, that sounds fine." He moved away down the corridor. She picked up her embroidery again and sat in the gathering dark and listened to his footsteps and understood clearly and without sentiment that she had just passed the last moment of safety, the last day in which what she was doing could have remained entirely below the surface. Fairfield would file on Thursday. By Friday, perhaps Saturday, Oliver would know. She had 4 days. 4 days to prepare herself for the conversation she had been building toward since the morning she stood in the entrance hall and counted the empty spaces on the walls, and understood that the man who had described the world to her had been describing a world of his own invention. 4 days to decide what she wanted to say, and what after everything she wanted to become. 4 days turned into 3. Oliver found out on Wednesday. She did not know exactly how, whether Fairfield's clerk had mentioned the filing to someone, whether the county recorder had sent notification faster than expected, or whether Oliver had his own sources inside the city, who moved quickly when his interests required it. It did not ultimately matter. What mattered was that she was in the writing room at 10 in the morning when she heard his step in the corridor. Not his ordinary step, not the measured, comfortable stride of a man moving through his own house with the ease of long possession, but something faster, harder, with a quality of forward momentum that she had never heard from him before, in 10 years of listening to every variation of his movement. She set her pen down. He opened the door without knocking. She looked at his face. In the weeks since her sight had returned, she had been building a new vocabulary for Oliver's expressions, learning to read what the sound of his voice had always given her in partial translation, now seeing the full text for the first time. She had learned the specific quality of his careful attention, the particular compression of his mouth when he was managing something he preferred not to show, the way his eyes moved when he was deciding what to say before he said it. She had not yet seen his face like this. It was not anger exactly. It was something more complicated, the face of a man who had been maintaining an enormous structure through constant effort and has just felt the first support beam give way. Fear, and something almost like relief fighting underneath the surface, and on top of it, tightly controlled the expression he had decided to present. "I received a communication this morning," he said, "from the county clerk's office." She waited. "Regarding a petition." He stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. "Filed by Daniel Fairfield, on your behalf." "Yes, one word." She gave him nothing else. She had thought about this moment for 4 days, had imagined it many ways, had drafted arguments and responses and counterpositions in her head, the way you drafted them when you had a great deal of time to think and a very specific need to be ready. But in the actual moment, with him standing 6 feet from her and his face doing what it was doing, she found that one word was enough. He absorbed it. She watched him absorb it, watched the slight movement of his jaw, the breath he took that was slightly longer than a normal breath. "You might have come to me first." She let that sit in the room for a moment. "Oliver," she said, "you forged my signature on 5 legal documents." The silence that followed was the most complete silence she had experienced since the night of the scream. Even the house seemed to hold itself still around them. No creak of board, no settle of fire, no wind against the glass. Just the two of them in a room together, with the truth finally present between them, taking up all the available air. His face changed. Not a collapse, he was not a man who collapsed, but a shift like ground settling after something has moved beneath it. "I was protecting you," he said. She had known he would say it. She had known it with the certainty of a woman who had spent 10 years learning to predict what came next from the sounds that preceded it. She had prepared for it since the morning in the library when she first counted the empty shelves and understood what preparation was going to be necessary, and still hearing it in his actual voice, in this actual room. Something inside her contracted sharply, not with surprise, but with the specific pain of a thing you knew was coming, and found when it arrived to be worse than you had constructed in advance. "Protecting me," she said. "The estate was in difficulty, serious difficulty. Before we were even married, your father never told you, Sarah. He was proud, he wouldn't have told you, but the Hartwell lands were carrying debt of their own when he died. I consolidated it. I managed it. The sales were necessary to keep us solvent, to keep the household running, to keep the staff employed, and the roof maintained, and—" He stopped, took another breath. "You couldn't see. You couldn't manage the accounts. What was I supposed to do?" She stood up. Not from anger. She had told herself she would not do this from anger, that anger was what he could manage most easily, that a woman who was angry was a woman who could be calmed or accommodated or waited out. She stood because she needed to be on her feet for what she was about to say. "You were supposed to tell me the truth," she said. "That is what you were supposed to do." And what would that have achieved? "You couldn't." "I could hear. I could think. I could speak to my own solicitor and make my own decisions about my own property." Her voice was level. "I was blind, Oliver. I was not incapable. You treated those two things as though they were the same." He was quiet for a moment. She watched his face and saw something move through it. Not contrition, not yet, but the beginning of a recognition. The first crack in the structure of the story he had been telling himself. "I did what I believed was best," he said. "You did what was easiest," she said, "for you, and you told yourself it was the same thing." He left the room without another word. She stood and listened to his footsteps moving away down the corridor, slower now than when he had arrived, heavier, and she remained standing until the sound of them faded completely. Then she sat back down, picked up her pen, and continued the letter she had been writing to Eleanor when he came in, because there was nothing that needed to be done in this moment that was not already in motion, and because finishing the letter was what she had intended to do this morning, and she saw no reason to let his entrance and his exit determine the shape of her day. She had spent 10 years letting the people around her determine the shape of her days. That was finished. The afternoon was difficult. Oliver did not come to dinner. Mrs. Pemberton reported with the careful neutrality of a woman who had managed a household through difficult seasons and had learned to be a neutral vessel for whatever moved through them, that Mr. Kingsley had asked for a tray in the study. Sarah ate alone in the dining room at the long table and looked at the walls and the missing paintings and the brass candlesticks that were not her mother's, and she ate everything on her plate with the deliberate attention of a woman who understood that what came next was going to require all the strength she could hold. After dinner, she went to the drawing room and sat by the fire and waited. He came at 9 o'clock. She heard him coming, the changed quality of his step again, but different from this morning. The energy gone out of it, replaced by something slower and more effortful. The step of a man who had spent 7 hours alone with himself and had found the company difficult. He sat in the chair across from her. The fire moved between them. "How long?" he said. She knew what he was asking. "I can see clearly since London. The procedure was 3 weeks before I came home. She watched him work this out, watched the calculation move through his expression, the backward accounting of the past 3 weeks. Every conversation, every meal, every morning, she had moved through the house with her cane, while her eyes were open and working and cataloging everything he had believed was invisible to her. "You said nothing." "No. For 3 weeks He stopped. "You were watching me." "I was learning the truth," she said, "since you hadn't chosen to tell it to me." Something moved across his face that she did not have a word for. Yet. Not shame exactly, not anger, but a complicated amalgam of both, with something underneath them that might have been in another context respect. The expression of a man who had just realized that the woman across from him was not who he had believed her to be. That she had never been who he had believed her to be. That the blindness he had relied upon had only ever been in his eyes. "The scream," she said. "In the West Wing, the night I came back from the stairs. Who was it?" He was very still. "Oliver." "A woman from the village," he said finally, quietly. "She came to the manor on a personal matter." She became upset. It had nothing to do with the finances with the estate. "I'm not asking about the finances right now." He closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. "Her name is Clara Briggs. Her father was a tenant on the Hartwell land before the sale. She came to ask about the tenancy. What would happen to them now that the land had changed hands? She became distressed. Clara Briggs, a tenant farmer's daughter, coming to ask what had happened to the land her family worked land sold without the knowledge of the woman who owned it, signed away on a document with a forged signature and a countersign that had never been made. How old is she? 22. Does she know I exist? Of course she." He stopped. "Yes, she knows. She was afraid to come to you directly. She came to me because she believed I managed the estate. Because I was blind." He said nothing. "Because everyone believed that I was blind, and therefore the decisions of this estate were made by you, and therefore Clara Briggs, who needed help, went to you, because going to the lady of the manor would have been going to someone who couldn't manage her own affairs." She kept her voice even through every word of it. "Do you understand what blindness actually cost me, Oliver? Not the sight. The sight was the fever's doing, not yours. What it cost me was standing. Credibility. The legal right to be consulted about my own property. You didn't take those things from me intentionally at the start, but you used them. You used them for 10 years, and you called it protection. And I want you to understand, I want you to be very clear that I know the difference." The fire crackled. Outside wind. The ordinary sounds of the manor at night, which she knew better than she had ever known anything in her life, sounds that had been her entire world for a decade, while the visible world went on around her unchecked. Oliver had his face in his hands. She watched him. She did not rush to fill the silence. After a long moment, he raised his head. His eyes were dry. He was not a man who cried easily, and she had not expected it. But there was something in his face that was rawer than she had seen it stripped of the careful management he usually maintained. "The debt was my father's," he said, "before I inherited. I didn't tell you because I was ashamed of it, and because at the start, I believed I could manage it without touching the Hartwell assets, and then—" He stopped. "And then I couldn't. And you were ill. And when you came through the fever and couldn't see the decision was already made in my head before I fully realized I was making it. I told myself it was temporary, that I'd recover the losses and restore everything before it ever became relevant." She absorbed this, the origin story. She had wondered about it, had constructed several possible versions during the long evenings of the past 3 weeks, sitting with her embroidery, while her eyes moved around the room and her mind built and rebuilt the architecture of how this had happened. This version was both worse and more comprehensible than the worst one she had imagined. Not cold calculation from the beginning. A man drowning in his father's debt, who had found in his wife's blindness a door he could open without being seen. "Did you ever intend to tell me?" she asked. The longest pause yet. "I don't know," he said. I think I intended to fix it first, and then it got larger instead of smaller, and the longer it went on, the less I could see how to start the conversation." He looked at her across the fire. I convinced myself you were that not knowing was kinder, that you were content, that the life you had, whatever else was true about it, was a good one. It was your life, she said. Not mine. Mine was inside it, following your description of it, because I had no other way to see. He nodded. Not in agreement exactly, or not only. In acknowledgement. The nod of a man receiving something he deserved to receive and knowing it. What happens now? He said. The petition proceeds, she said. Fairfield will manage it. And us. She looked at him for a long moment. At his face, this face she had reconstructed from memory for 10 years, that was both familiar and strange to her, now that she could actually see it. The lines she hadn't known were there. The gray at his temples. The way he held himself when the management was gone, when there was nothing left to construct between himself and what he had done. I don't know yet, she said honestly. I know what was taken from me. I know what needs to be restored. What we are when that is finished, I don't know. He nodded again, stood slowly, the movement of a man carrying weight. Sarah. He stopped at the door. I am there isn't a word that's sufficient. I know that. She did not answer. She turned back to the fire and listened to his step moving away down the corridor, and she sat alone with the flames until they burned low, and she let herself feel for the first time the full measure of what had been taken. Not the land, not the silver, not the portraits. 10 years. 10 years of a life lived inside someone else's story, trusting a narrator who had been editing as he went, removing the difficult chapters, describing only what suited the version he needed her to believe. 10 years of a woman who was not incapable, who had been sharp and careful and fully present in her own life, who had simply been unable to see and had been managed because of it, steered and contained and kept comfortable in a version of reality that served someone else's need. She sat with all of it. She did not flinch from it. And when the fire burned down to coals, she rose, took up her cane out of habit, and walked through the dark manor to her room with her eyes open. The county hearing was scheduled for a Thursday in January. The weeks between the confrontation and the hearing had a particular quality she had not anticipated. Not the dramatic tension of open conflict, but the sustained, exhausting weight of two people living in the same house, while a legal process took place around them, like weather neither of them could control. Oliver did not fight the petition. This surprised her, and then when she thought about it, did not. He had his solicitor review Fairfield's documentation. His solicitor evidently told him what Fairfield had told her, that the case was sound, that the forged instruments were demonstrably forged, that his position was not defensible on the primary points. And Oliver Kingsley, whatever else he was not a man who wasted energy on battles he had already calculated he would lose. He was instead a man trying to determine what could be salvaged. He came to her 3 days before the hearing. She was in the library. She had been spending time there, in the half-empty room, which she found she did not mind as much as she had expected. There was something almost clarifying about the empty shelves. The visible evidence of what had been. The gap between what was and what had been described. He came in and sat in the chair near the window and said without preamble, I want to offer a settlement, outside the court process. She waited. Complete restitution of the Hartwell land value. The land itself cannot be recovered, the sales are too old, the new owners are innocent parties. But the monetary value at current rates paid over a period of... He paused. Paid in full within 3 years. I've spoken with a financial agent in the city about restructuring the mortgage on more favorable terms. It can be done. And the silver, the library, the portraits. The auction house records are complete. Fairfield's team has identified what was sold, and in several cases where it was purchased. I've made inquiries. The silver, most of it can be bought back. The books, most of them. The portraits are more complicated, but... He stopped, and she saw him do something she had not seen him do before, visibly struggle. I can find them. I believe I can find most of them. She looked at him. I was not asking for forgiveness. She noted this, and found it more meaningful than if he had. He was not presenting himself as repentant, or reformed, or deserving of anything in particular. He was presenting a practical solution with the manner of a man who understood that practical solutions were the most he was in a position to offer. "Why?" she said. "Why a settlement rather than the court?" "Because the hearing will be public," he said. "And a settlement can include terms that protect your interest without requiring—" He stopped again. "Because you've lived quietly here for 10 years and you have done nothing wrong, and I don't want the public process to cost you what it will cost you." She studied his face. There was truth in this, she could see it, literally. See it, could read the honesty in his expression with the clarity she had not had for a decade. He did not want the public process. That was also true. But beneath that, she saw something else, a genuine if belated concern for the shape of her life. After all of this, a caring that had been real all along, twisted out of its proper form by the decisions that surrounded it. Both things were true. She found no longer surprised by the coexistence of genuine care and serious harm inside the same person. "I want Fairfield to review any settlement terms," she said. "Every provision. Nothing is agreed without his approval and mine." "Of course. And I want a provision that the terms are enforceable, not a gentleman's agreement, a legal instrument with penalties for non-performance." He nodded. "And I want," she said more slowly, "a written acknowledgement. Not for the court, not for public record. A private document between us attested by Fairfield in which you acknowledge specifically what was done, and that my signature on those instruments was not mine." He was very still. "That is a significant thing to ask," he said. "Yes," she said, "it is." The silence stretched between them. She watched him, and he watched her, and she understood that this was the real negotiation. Not the money, not the land value, not the silver. The acknowledgement. The formal witnessed, legally attested admission that it had happened, that she had not consented, that the story he had told had not been the truth. "All right," he said. Rose. "Tell Fairfield to contact your solicitor." She walked past him to the door of the library and then stopped, because there was one more thing, one thing that had been sitting with her since the night of the fire, that she had not found the moment to say, and needed to say, before the process moved forward, and the saying became more complicated. "Oliver." She turned to look at him still in the chair by the window, and she let herself see him fully. Not the man she had married, not the man she had believed she knew, not the villain she might have made him, if grief had been simpler than it was, but the man actually sitting in front of her in this half-empty library, in January light, carrying something she suspected he would carry the rest of his life. "I don't think you are evil. I want you to know that. I think you made choices, you kept making them when you should have stopped, and you let the first ones make the next ones easier. And I think the part of you that called it protection was not entirely lying to itself." She paused. "But the part of you that knew the difference and chose convenience anyway, that part knew what it was doing. And I cannot forgive that part from a distance. I cannot forgive something I cannot see clearly. And I spent 10 years unable to see anything clearly." He said nothing. His face was doing something she didn't have a word for. She left the library and went back to her writing room and closed the door. Fairfield reviewed the settlement terms over 4 days. He negotiated 3 provisions she would not have thought to ask for: an accelerated payment schedule with compounding penalties, a first right provision on any future Hartwell land sales, and a clause that preserved her right to pursue further legal action if the terms were not met within specified periods. He reported all of this to her in the writing room, with the compressed satisfaction of a man who had spent 40 years preparing precisely for this kind of moment. "It is," he said, "a sound agreement. Better than the court outcome." He considered this with the honesty she had come to rely on. "The court would likely find in your favor on the core claims. But the recovery process would be lengthy, expensive, and public. The settlement achieves the primary financial objective and includes the private acknowledgement you requested, which the court process would not have provided." A pause. "I believe your father would have approved of this outcome. He was a practical man." "He was," she agreed. She signed the settlement agreement on a Wednesday morning in February, with Fairfield on one side of the desk and Oliver's solicitor on the other, and Oliver himself standing by the window with his hands at his sides, and his face arranged into the composure of a man who had accepted what was happening and was choosing at the end to meet it with some measure of dignity. When the papers were signed, Fairfield closed his case and stood and extended his hand to her. "Lady Kingsley," he said, "it has been an honor." She shook his hand. After he left, and after his solicitor left, she and Oliver were alone in the room for the first time since the night of the fire. He was still by the window. She was at the desk, the signed papers in front of her. "There's something I need to tell you," he said. She waited. "The night you came back from London." He did not turn from the window. "When you got out of the carriage and I helped you to the door. I saw something different in how you moved. I couldn't name it, but something was different." He paused. "I think part of me knew that night, that something had changed. I didn't let myself follow the thought." She absorbed this. He had known, or nearly known, and had chosen not to know. One more choice in a long chain of them, each one selecting the comfortable version over the true one. Even at the end, the pattern had held. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because I don't want to keep any more things that I should have said." He turned from the window finally and looked at her across the room. "It doesn't change anything. I know that. But I'm tired of deciding what you're better off not knowing." She looked at him for a long moment. "That is," she said carefully, "the first thing you have said to me in this conversation that I don't have to examine for the angle." Something moved through his expression, brief, painful, honest. "I'll take that," he said quietly. The acknowledgement document was the last to be executed. Fairfield had drafted it with the precision of a man who understood that language mattered, that the specific words of an admission shaped what the admission meant, and that a document like this one would be read very carefully by the woman who had asked for it and must say exactly what it needed to say. It said in formal legal language, with all the careful architecture of a document written to last, that the signatures on the 5 instruments of sale had not been made by Lady Sarah Hartwell Kingsley, that no consent had been given, that the sales had proceeded without her knowledge, that the countersignature of Daniel Fairfield had been reproduced without his knowledge or participation. Oliver signed it himself in the presence of Fairfield as witness, with the steady hand of a man who had made his decision and was executing it without further hesitation. Fairfield signed as witness. Sarah took the document and read it herself, word by word, with her own eyes, from the first line to the signature at the bottom. She read it the way she would have read a letter from her father, completely, without rushing, giving each sentence the attention it warranted. Then she folded it and placed it in the inside pocket of her traveling case. "What will you do with it?" Oliver said. "Keep it," she said. "That's all. Just keep it." She understood, and she believed. He understood that the document was not for use. It was not a weapon she was saving for a future engagement. It was something else, the written proof that the story she had been living inside was not the true one, that her version of events was real, that the blindness had been his and not hers, and that it had been acknowledged, witnessed, and set down in formal language by the man who had made it necessary. She needed it to exist, not to use, simply to exist. She put her traveling case in the hall and went back to the writing room one last time. She stood in the small room where she had written to Fairfield, where she had written to Reed, where she had over the past months slowly and carefully begun to reconstruct the version of reality she was owed. She was leaving the manor for a period. She and Fairfield had discussed it. She would go to Eleanor's house in London while the financial arrangements were executed, while the recovery of the silver and the books was organized, while the long practical work of restoration was underway. She would return when there was something to return to that was actually hers. Mrs. Pemberton met her in the entrance hall to say goodbye, and her composure, which had held through everything, very nearly did not hold through. Mrs. Pemberton's face, the careful, kind, completely neutral face of a woman who had served this household for 20 years and who had, Sarah understood, suddenly known more than she had ever said, and kept it because that was what loyalty required, and because she had not known how to help. "Mrs. Pemberton," she said, "I want you to know whatever happens next, you have nothing to answer for." The housekeeper's composure bent slightly briefly and then held. "Thank you, my lady." Thomas had the carriage ready. Oliver came to the door. They stood in the entrance hall and looked at each other fully, clearly, the way two people could look at each other when both of them had working eyes and no more useful fictions to maintain. His face said several things at once, and she let herself read all of them without resolving them into something simpler. "I'll manage the estate honestly," he said, "for whatever that is worth." "It's worth something," she said. "Not much, but something." He stepped forward, and for a moment she thought he was going to reach for her hand, and then he stopped, because she had not extended it, and the half-movement resolved itself into nothing, not rejection, not acceptance, just the accurate reading of a situation. "Safe travel," he said. "Thank you, Oliver." She turned and walked to the carriage. Thomas handed her up. She settled into the seat and looked out the window at the manor at Kingsley Manor, the house she had lived in as a blind woman for 10 years, trusting the story she was told about it, moving through rooms she could not see with the careful competence of someone navigating a world they could not verify. She looked at it with her own eyes in the gray February light, the weathered stone, the broken shutter. Someone had not yet repaired the overgrown formal garden. The carriage moved. She watched the manor recede through the window, and she did not look away until it was gone entirely from her sight. And then she turned forward and looked at the road ahead. The actual road, the real one, the one that existed outside anyone's description of it. And she breathed steadily and completely in and out, and let herself understand what had changed. She had signed a document this morning that gave her back her father's land in value, if not in form. She carried in her traveling case a written acknowledgement of the truth. And she was riding away from a house that had held her blind in every sense, in every dimension of the word for a decade, toward a city and a cousin and a future that she would describe for herself. For the first time in 10 years, she was not inside someone else's story. The road moved beneath the wheels. The winter light fell clean and cold across everything. And Sarah Miller opened her eyes, both of them fully and without pretense, with no more need for the careful unfocus, no more management of what she was allowed to see, and she watched the world go past, and found it in all its imperfect and unnarrated reality to be the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. Eleanor's house in Mayfair smelled of dried lavender and strong tea, and the particular comfort of a woman who had arranged her life exactly as she wanted it and intended to keep it that way. Sarah had been there 11 days when the letter arrived. Not from Fairfield, not from Oliver's solicitor, from Clara Briggs. She sat with it for a long moment after Eleanor finished reading it aloud, sat with the surprise of it because she had not expected. This had not anticipated that the young woman from the village, the tenant farmer's daughter who had come into the manor on the night of the scream, would find her address and write to her directly. The letter was short. 3 paragraphs, the handwriting uncertain in the way of someone who had learned to write carefully, but did not do it often. It said that Clara had heard about the petition, that her father's family had worked the Hartwell Eastern Acres for 2 generations before the sale, that she was not writing to ask for anything she was clear about. This repeated it, but that she had information she believed Lady Kingsley should have, and that she would come to London if Lady Kingsley was willing to receive her. Eleanor looked at her across the breakfast table when she finished reading it. "Well," Eleanor said. "Write back," Sarah said. "Tell her Thursday." Eleanor wrote. Clara came on Thursday, arriving at the Mayfair house with the careful composure of a young woman who had dressed very deliberately for an encounter she was nervous about and was determined not to show it. She was small, with her father's coloring, and she sat in Eleanor's parlor, with her hands folded in her lap, and looked at Sarah with an expression that contained something Sarah recognized, the particular watchfulness of a person who had been trying to determine for some time whether they could trust what they were seeing. "You're not what I expected," Clara said. "What did you expect?" "I don't know exactly." A pause. "Someone more. I thought you'd be frailer. Everyone in the village talks about Lady Kingsley as though she's made of something that needs to be handled carefully. Everyone in the village knew me as a blind woman whose husband managed her affairs." "Yes." Clara's hands tightened briefly in her lap. That's part of what I wanted to tell you." What Clara told her took 40 minutes and required 2 cups of tea and 1 pause during which she stopped speaking entirely for almost a minute, looking at the window with the expression of someone deciding at the last moment how much of a thing they were genuinely prepared to say. What she said was this: Her father had been approached in 1814 by a man acting on Oliver Kingsley's behalf regarding the sale of the Eastern Hartwell acres. The man had represented the sale as having been authorized by Lady Kingsley herself, who was, he explained, aware of the financial necessities and had reviewed and approved the transaction. Her father had asked directly whether Lady Kingsley had been consulted because he had worked Hartwell land long enough to know that Edward Hartwell had built protections into his daughter's settlement specifically to prevent exactly this kind of situation. The man had told him yes. Absolutely. Lady Kingsley's signature was on the documentation. Her father had accepted this. He was not a legal man. He did not know how to read a settlement, or examine a signature, or understand what a trustee's countersignature was meant to guarantee. He had taken the word of the man in front of him, signed the surrender of his tenancy, and moved his family to a smaller holding further north. But before he left, he had done something careful. He had kept a copy of the notice of sale with the signature identified as Lady Kingsley's, because he had been her father's tenant, and he had liked Edward Hartwell, and something about the transaction had sat uneasily with him in a way he could not legally articulate but could not dismiss. Clara opened her traveling bag and took out a folded paper. "He kept it," she said. "He showed it to me when I was older and told me that if I ever had reason to think it mattered, I should find a way to put it in the right hands." She set it on the table between them. Sarah picked it up and read it with her own eyes. The notice of sale. The forged signature identified below the line as Sarah Hartwell Kingsley. And beside it in a hand that was not Fairfield's a hand, she did not recognize a countersignature that claimed to be Daniel Fairfield's. Two forgeries, not one. On every document, two separate forgeries. Someone had practiced two signatures, not just hers. "Clara," she said carefully, "do you know the name of the man who came to your father?" He introduced himself as Mr. Alderman, a financial agent acting for Mr. Kingsley. She filed the name. "Would your father be willing to give a sworn statement about what Alderman told him?" Clara looked at her steadily. "That's why I came." She sent for Fairfield that afternoon. He arrived the following morning and sat in Eleanor's parlor and looked at the notice of sale with the expression of a man whose suspicions, carefully maintained at professional distance for several years, had just been confirmed in a way that made them considerably more actionable. "Alderman," he said. "I know that name." Sarah looked at him sharply. "He operates as a financial intermediary, private lending asset brokerage, the gray area between legitimate finance and less legitimate arrangements." Fairfield set the paper down with the precise care of a man handling evidence. "He was involved in the mortgage on Kingsley Manor. I found his name in the records during the initial investigation, but his role appeared to be that of a broker, nothing more." A pause. "If he was also the agent who represented the Hartwell land sales to the tenants, and if he was the one who forged my countersignature—" He stopped. "Then Oliver may not have forged the documents himself," Sarah said. "He may have engaged someone to do it." She sat with this. The distinction mattered. Not morally engaging. Alderman to forge the documents was not meaningfully different from forging them himself, and she was not going to allow that distinction to become a refuge for Oliver's conscience or hers. But legally, it mattered, because if Alderman had forged Fairfield's countersignature, he had committed a serious criminal offense that went well beyond the civil matter of the settlement already agreed. And if Alderman could be found and examined, there might be documentation. There was almost always documentation in her experience when money changed hands through intermediaries that would clarify precisely what Oliver had known and when and what he had instructed. "Can Alderman be located?" she said. Fairfield allowed himself a very brief, very dry expression that she was learning to interpret as his version of satisfaction. "I have colleagues who are considerably better than I am at locating men who prefer not to be found. With Mr. Briggs's statement and this document," he touched the notice of sale. "Yes, I believe he can be located." "Then find him." Fairfield looked at her with the particular attention he had been giving her since the beginning of this. The look of a man recalibrating his understanding of someone each time they opened their mouth. "Lady Kingsley," he said, "may I ask what outcome are you seeking beyond the settlement already executed?" She thought about this honestly. "I want the complete truth on record," she said. "Not just what Oliver agreed to acknowledge. The full account what Alderman did on whose instruction, with what documentation. I want it on record, not because I intend to destroy Oliver, but because I spent 10 years inside an incomplete account, and I find that I cannot stop until the whole of it is visible." She paused. "And because Clara Briggs's father deserves to know that what he suspected was true, and that the woman whose land it was never agreed to any of it." Fairfield nodded once, the nod of a man who understood completely. "I'll be in contact within the fortnight," he said. It took 19 days. Alderman was found in Birmingham, operating under a slightly different professional name, in slightly different financial arrangements, which surprised no one. Fairfield's colleague, a sharp compact solicitor named Marsh, who specialized in what he described with professional understatement as complex financial reconstructions, located him through a chain of property records and presented him with a precise accounting of what the evidence against him currently showed, and what cooperation might reasonably achieve versus what its absence would necessitate. Alderman cooperated. The documentation he produced was, as she had expected, thorough. Men who operated in Alderman's professional territory kept records not out of civic virtue, but out of self-protection. The detailed accounting of every transaction, every instruction, every payment maintained against the eventual need to demonstrate that someone else had initiated the arrangement. The instructions had come from Oliver, in writing. 3 of the 5 transactions had been preceded by letters in Oliver's hand, directing Alderman to prepare the instruments for execution, specifying the parcels, specifying the prices, specifying that the Kingsley name should not appear prominently in the buyer negotiations. Oliver had known, completely, from the first document. She received this information from Fairfield on a gray March morning in Eleanor's parlor, sitting across from him, with her hands in her lap, and the particular quality of stillness that had become her default mode for receiving large truths. Not the stillness of someone suppressing emotion, but the stillness of someone letting emotion be exactly what it was, without allowing it to reorganize them. She had told herself in the weeks since the confrontation that she did not know whether Oliver had been the architect or the executor, whether he had made the decision clearly and deliberately, or had been carried by it through a series of smaller choices that accumulated into something he would not have chosen to see whole. The letters to Alderman resolved that question. He had known. He had written it down. He had directed specifically and in detail the mechanism by which her property would be taken from her. "Are you all right?" Eleanor said from across the room. She had been in the corner with her book present but quiet the way Eleanor was present, available without crowding. "Yes," Sarah said, and meant it, which was the strangest part. She was all right, not happy, not undamaged, not finished grieving what had been taken, but all right in the specific sense of someone who has received a hard truth and found that receiving it fully without flinching, without the management of someone else's discomfort, was survivable, was in fact considerably more survivable than not knowing. She looked at Fairfield. "What can be done with this?" "The letters constitute evidence of a more serious offense than civil fraud," he said. "Alderman's forgeries are criminal. Oliver's direction of them his knowing participation." He paused. "There are options available to you that were not available before. Criminal proceedings if you choose to pursue them. Or," another pause, "the settlement already executed is not invalidated by this new information, but it can be renegotiated in light of it. Mr. Kingsley's position is considerably weaker now than it was when the settlement was signed." She thought about what Oliver had said in the library the night of the fire. "I did what I believed was best." And then later with the papers signed and the acknowledgement in her traveling case. "I'm tired of deciding what you're better off not knowing." He had written to Alderman. He had written specific instructions. He had known from the first document exactly what he was doing. And he had sat across from her in the firelight and said he had convinced himself it was protection. She stood up and went to the window. Eleanor's Mayfair Street, its ordinary morning commerce people going about the business of their days in full view of the world. "Write to Oliver's solicitor," she said. "Tell him we have the Alderman documentation and the letters. Tell him I want a meeting. Not solicitors only, Oliver present, in London." Fairfield made a note. "And the question of criminal proceedings." She turned from the window. That depends on the meeting. Oliver came to London. He arrived at the office of Fairfield's colleague Marsh Neutral Ground, which Marsh had insisted upon, and which she had agreed was appropriate on a Thursday afternoon in March. She was there when he came in, seated already at the long table, Fairfield on her right, Marsh across from her. Oliver's solicitor, a careful man named Greaves, whom she had met once before, came in behind him. Oliver looked at her, and she looked at Oliver, and she understood from his face that he had read the letter Marsh had sent, and understood what the alderman documentation meant, and had spent the journey from the county with this meeting waiting for him at the end of it. He looked tired, genuinely tired, in the way of a man who had not slept well in weeks and had stopped maintaining the appearance of a man who had. He sat down. Greaves began to speak the procedural opening, the established positions, the formal language of a meeting between legal representatives, and Sarah let it go on for approximately 90 seconds before she said, "Mr. Greaves, I'd like to speak with my husband directly for a moment if you don't object." Greaves looked at Oliver. Oliver nodded. She looked at Oliver across the table. Fairfield and Marsh and Greaves all had the specific quality of people trying to be present without being intrusive. The professional stillness of men who understood that what was about to happen in this room was not at its core a legal matter. "You wrote to Alderman," she said, "before the first sale. You directed the preparation of the instruments. You knew from the beginning what those documents were." He did not look away from her. "Yes, not a series of smaller decisions that accumulated. Not a problem that grew larger than you'd planned and carried you with it. A decision." "Yes." His voice was quiet, entirely steady. The voice of a man who had arrived at this meeting having already decided not to hide any further behind the architecture of self-justification he had been maintaining. She absorbed this, the confirmation of what the letters had already told her in his own voice in this room. "Why are you admitting this?" she said. "Your solicitor would advise you not to." "Because you already know," he said, "and because I'm done." He looked at the table for a moment, then back at her. "I've been done for some time, I think. I just kept going because stopping would have required—" He paused. "Stopping would have required telling you the truth, and I could not find the courage for it." The room was very quiet. "Oliver," she said, and something shifted in her voice that she had not intended, not softness exactly, but the specific quality of a woman who had reached the far side of anger and found something more complicated waiting. "Do you understand what the courage you didn't find cost me?" "Yes." Not a defense, not a qualification, just the word alone. She sat with it. Then she looked at Fairfield. "The settlement terms stand. I am not pursuing criminal proceedings." She watched Greaves's shoulders drop slightly in relief. "However, the settlement is to be amended. The repayment period is shortened to 18 months rather than 3 years. A full independent audit of Kingsley Manor finances is to be completed within 60 days, and the results provided to me directly. And," she paused, "a trust is to be established for the Briggs family funded by the Kingsley estate in an amount sufficient to restore the tenancy position they held before the sale. Clara Briggs's father acted in good faith. He should not carry the cost of someone else's fraud." Greaves was writing rapidly. Oliver had not looked away from her. "That is," Greaves began. "Those are the terms," she said pleasantly. The way she said things, she was not going to negotiate. "Mr. Fairfield has the drafted language." Fairfield produced the documents which he had prepared before the meeting, because she had asked him to prepare them before the meeting, because she had known what she was going to ask for, and had seen no reason to make anyone wait while the words were found. Oliver signed. She watched his hand move across the paper, and she thought about the forgeries. The practiced imitation of her signature studied from her correspondence, reproduced on 5 documents. She thought about what it required to do that. To sit with someone's handwriting and learn the specific shape of their letters until you could replicate it convincingly enough to pass. To see a woman's way of writing her own name and decide to write it yourself for your own purposes in her absence. She had never hated him for it. That was the truth of it, which she had only recently been able to say clearly. She had been angry, a deep, thorough, entirely justified anger that had fueled the 6 months of methodical work that brought her to this table. But anger was not hate, and she had never crossed the line into wanting his destruction, because his destruction would have required her to make him the sole reason this had happened, and she was too honest for that. She had also not seen. She had trusted when trust required examination. She had accepted a narrated world without asking to verify the narration. She bore none of the moral responsibility for what he had done. But she carried and had privately acknowledged the human truth that her own willingness to be comfortable inside the story she was told had made the story easier to maintain. She was 35 years old, and she had spent 10 of those years blind, and 5 of those 10 years being robbed, and she was going to spend the rest of them, however many remained, seeing everything that could be seen, examining everything that could be examined, and never again trusting someone else's description of the world over the evidence of her own eyes. The papers were signed. The meeting concluded. Marsh and Greaves gathered their documents. Fairfield stood and shook her hand with the dignity of a man who had done the thing he had been built by 4 decades of careful practice to do. Oliver stood across the table. They were briefly alone. Fairfield tactfully engaged with Marsh near the door, Greaves consulting his notes, and Oliver looked at her with the expression she had come to recognize as his honest one. Not managed, not shaped for any specific effect, simply the face he had when the construction was down. "What will you do?" he asked. Not about the estate, not about the legal matters. The larger question, the one that had been in the room since the night of the fire. "Go back to the county," she said. "To the manor. Manage it myself, or have Fairfield help me manage it until I've learned enough to do it alone. Restore what can be restored. Build what can't be restored." She paused. "I'm going to find Clara Briggs a proper position if she wants one. She has more courage than most people I've met." Something moved through his expression. Not quite a smile. Something more complicated than a smile. "And us," he said. The same question he had asked on the night of the fire in the same voice with the same quality of genuine uncertainty beneath it. She looked at him carefully. This man she had married at 23, who had charmed her and frightened her and stolen from her and signed the acknowledgement of it and come to this meeting and confirmed the worst of it without flinching. This man who was not a villain and was not innocent and was not, she had concluded, reducible to either of those things. "I don't know yet," she said. The same answer she had given on the night of the fire. And then she added what she had not said that night. "But I know now that not knowing is something I can hold without letting it hold me. That's different from how things were." He nodded. And she understood that he understood what she meant, that the not knowing she carried now was a choice. An open question she was holding, with her eyes open. Not the not knowing of a woman inside someone else's story, who had never been given the option to ask. She picked up her gloves from the table. "Safe travel back to the county," she said. She walked past him to the door where Fairfield was waiting with his leather case, and the quietly satisfied bearing of a man whose life's work had this afternoon meant exactly what he had always believed it should mean. They went out together into the March afternoon. The city was all around them. The noise of it, the press of it, the complete indifferent motion of thousands of people going about their days, without any knowledge of what had just been settled in a room above this street. She walked through it and felt it as she had felt the train moving under her on the journey to London 6 months ago, forward. Only forward. The direction for the first time in a very long time, entirely her own. "Fairfield," she said as they reached the corner where his carriage was waiting. "My lady. My father was right about you." The old solicitor looked at her. His face did briefly the thing that Eleanor's face had done on the morning Reed removed the bandages, the controlled flicker of something genuine held carefully in place. "He was a wise man," Fairfield said. "In many respects." She smiled. The first entirely unguarded smile she had produced in, she did not know how long. "Thursday," she said. "I'll come to your office Thursday and we'll begin the audit. I'll have everything ready." She walked to Eleanor's carriage, and Thomas handed her up with the steady reliability of a man who had always known more than he said, and had always, in the ways available to him, been on her side. She settled into the seat. The carriage moved into the London traffic. She did not look back at the building she had come from. She was looking forward at the street ahead, at the city, moving past the window, at the life that was, for the first time in a decade, being built from her own choices on her own terms. The acknowledgement document was in her traveling case. The settlement was executed. The alderman letters were in Fairfield's keeping, and Sarah Miller, née Hartwell, 35 years old, blind for 10 years, and seeing again for 6 months, robbed and documented, and finally fully legally restored, sat in the carriage, with her eyes open and her hands steady in her lap, and thought about what it meant to go home. Not to Oliver's Manor. Not to the house someone else had managed and narrated for her while she moved through it in darkness. Home to the Hartwell acres, to what remained of them, to what could be rebuilt of them, to the land her father had protected with such particular care, because he had known better than she had that protection was necessary. She was going to need to learn. She knew this plainly and without shame. Estate management, agricultural accounts, tenant relations, the legal architecture of a landed property. These were not things a woman who had spent 10 years in managed blindness simply possessed. She was going to have to acquire them piece by piece, the way she had acquired everything that mattered to her since the fever, through careful attention, through listening well, through the willingness to move through unfamiliar territory, with her cane in her hand and her face composed and her mind absolutely completely awake. She thought, well practiced at exactly that. The carriage moved through London. The March light was thin and clean on everything it touched. And somewhere in the county, a manor house waited with its half-empty library and its overgrown garden and its broken shutter and its honest, unnarrated imperfection, and it was hers. She came back to Kingsley Manor on the 1st of April, not because the date was symbolic. She was not a woman who traded in symbols when the practical would serve, but because the audit was complete, the amended settlement terms had been executed. The Briggs Family Trust had been established, and Fairfield had given her the accounting she had asked for, in the form of a document she had read 3 times, beginning to end with her own eyes, before she was satisfied that she understood every line of it. She understood every line of it. Thomas drove her from the station. The same road, the same turn at the elm, the same final approach through the gates. She had made this journey blind, then seeing secretly, then leaving with the full weight of what she'd discovered. Now she made it as something she did not quite have a word for, yet not victorious, because victory implied a battle, and she was finished thinking of it as a battle, and not healed, because healing implied a wound that was closed, and some of what this had cost her would never fully close. Something more like clear. She was clear. That was the word that fit. The manor came into view. She looked at it with the direct, unmanaged gaze she now used for everything. The broken shutter was still broken. She noticed and noted it with the businesslike attention of a woman who was making a list. The shutter. The east garden. The library shelves. The portrait of her grandfather, which Fairfield's people believed they had located at an estate sale in Shropshire, and which was going to require a letter and a negotiation she was looking forward to. Mrs. Pemberton met her at the door. The housekeeper's composure was firmly in place, but Sarah had learned in 6 months of looking at faces with working eyes to read the things composure covered. What it covered in Mrs. Pemberton's face was relief. Simple, genuine, the relief of a woman who had served a household through a very difficult season and was glad to see the person she actually worked for walk back through the front door. "Welcome home, my lady." "Thank you, Mrs. Pemberton." She stepped inside. The entrance hall with the unfamiliar landscape in place of her grandfather. She looked at it directly. "That painting comes down this week. The wall will stay empty until we can bring the portrait back. I'd rather look at bare plaster than something that doesn't belong there." Mrs. Pemberton's composure performed a very brief, very contained movement that might in another woman have been a smile. "Yes, my lady. Oliver was not at this manor. This was by arrangement. She had communicated through Greaves that she would be returning on the 1st, and that she would find it useful to have a period of time in the house without his presence to conduct the initial assessment. He had gone to stay with cousins in the north. She did not know how long he would be gone, and she had not specified, and she thought that the open timeline was honest in a way that a specified one would not have been. She did not know what she wanted the future to look like. She was not going to pretend she did in order to give anyone, including herself, the comfort of a resolved answer. She had learned at considerable cost the damage that resolved answers could do when they were chosen for comfort rather than truth. The audit had revealed 3 things she had not known and needed to. The first was that the Kingsley Manor mortgage, while substantial, was not unsurvivable. The restructured terms. Fairfield's financial contacts had negotiated the terms Oliver had agreed to. As part of the amended settlement were tight but manageable if the estate was run efficiently and the remaining tenant income was properly collected. There had been a pattern Fairfield's auditor discovered of tenant income being underreported in the estate accounts, which meant either that Oliver had been falsifying that too, or that the estate manager, a man named Holt, had been taking the difference. The auditor believed it was Holt. Fairfield intended to pursue it. She had told him to proceed. The second was that 2 of the 5 Hartwell Acres parcels were available for repurchase. The original buyers had not developed them. One had recently encountered financial difficulties of his own, and Fairfield believed both parcels could be reacquired at rates the settlement fund could support without straining the manor's restructured finances. She had told him to make the offers. The third thing was smaller and larger at the same time. The Hartwell estate accounts going back to the period of her father's final years showed that Edward Hartwell had in fact been carrying debt. Oliver had been right about that much. It had not been an invention, but the debt had been manageable. A careful, competent estate manager, working with full information and proper legal authority, could have serviced it without touching the principal assets. The sales had not been necessary in the way Oliver had told himself they were. They had been the solution of a man who wanted to move quickly and quietly and without the involvement of the person whose property it was. She sat with this third thing the longest, because it was the piece that made the whole story most clearly. What it was, not a man overwhelmed by circumstances beyond his control, but a man who had chosen the path that preserved his autonomy and taken what was not his to take in order to walk it without interference. He had told himself necessity. The accounts said choice. She had put the audit report in the bottom drawer of the writing room desk and left it there. She didn't need to keep reading it. She had read it enough to know it entirely. The knowing was what she'd needed. The document could sit in this drawer for the rest of its life. Clara Briggs came on a Wednesday in the second week. She came to the manor this time, not to the side door, not with the hesitancy of someone unsure of their welcome, but through the front entrance admitted by Mrs. Pemberton, and shown to the small sitting room where Sarah was working through the estate correspondence that had accumulated in her absence. Sarah looked up when Clara came in and saw in the young woman's face the particular quality of someone who had been uncertain about something for a long time and had arrived today at the resolution of that uncertainty. "I wanted to see it," Clara said without preamble. "The manor, where you actually live. I've been to the village and I've written letters, and I came that one time before that night." She stopped, glanced toward the corridor in the direction of the west wing. "But I've never actually seen it in daylight." "What do you think?" "It's smaller than I imagined." Clara looked around the sitting room with the frank curiosity of a woman who was not going to pretend she wasn't curious. "When you can't see a place, you build it bigger in your head." Sarah set down her pen. "Sit down, Clara." Clara sat, folded her hands in her lap with the same careful composure she'd had in Eleanor's parlor in London, the composure of a young woman who had taught herself to hold steady in rooms where she wasn't entirely sure of her footing. "I want to offer you something," Sarah said. "A position. Not a servant's position. I want to be specific about that. An assistant's position. Someone who helps me manage the correspondence and the tenant relations and the practical business of the estate, while I'm learning enough to do more of it alone." She paused. "You can read accounts, Clara. I know because your father's letter in London showed evidence of someone who helped him write it, and I believe that someone was you." Clara's composure wavered, very briefly. "He dictates and yes, I've kept his accounts since I was 14. Then you have skills I need. I'm offering fair wages, a proper contract through Fairfield's office, and the clear understanding that this is a working arrangement between 2 people with something to contribute to it, not a charity and not a favor." Sarah met her eyes directly. "You came to this manor to ask about land your family worked for 2 generations. You had every right to ask. I'm sorry the answer you received that night was not the one you deserved." Clara was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was steady, but not entirely. "Your husband told me you were. He said you weren't well enough to be consulted, that the management of the estate was his responsibility, and my father's tenancy was his decision to make. I know. I believed him, because you were everyone said. I know what everyone said. Sarah's voice was not unkind. I said something similar to myself for many years. It becomes very easy to accept what people tell you about your own limitations when you can't see well enough to disprove it. Clara looked at her with an expression that was both younger and older than her 22 years, the expression of someone processing something that was going to rearrange several things she had previously believed to be fixed. Yes, she said finally. I'll take the position. Sarah nodded, picked up her pen and returned to the correspondence. Fairfield's clerk will send the contract this week. You can start whenever you're ready. Clara stood, and then did not immediately move toward the door. Lady Kingsley. She paused. In the village, people are saying there are different stories. About you. About what happened. What are they saying? Some people say you tricked your husband, that you pretended to be blind longer than you were in order to build a case against him. Clara's voice was entirely neutral, reporting not editorializing. Some people say he was robbed by the settlement. That a wife taking legal action against her husband is... She stopped. Is what unnatural, that it sets a difficult example. Sarah finished the sentence she was writing before she answered. And what do you say, when people say these things? Clara stood in the doorway with the particular stillness of a young woman who has thought carefully about an answer. I say that Lady Kingsley was never actually blind, she said. She could always see. She was just the only person in the room who understood that. Sarah looked at her. Then she nodded once and turned back to her desk, and Clara Briggs went out the door with the quiet confidence of a woman who had just accepted a position she intended to be very good at. The letter from Oliver arrived in June. Not through solicitors, not through formal channels. A letter in his own hand addressed to her directly delivered in the ordinary post alongside the estate correspondence and the note from Fairfield about the Shropshire portrait negotiation, and a bill from the glazier who had repaired the east wing window. She opened it last. It was 3 pages. She read it at her writing room desk in the morning light with her tea cooling beside her, giving it the same attention she gave everything she read now, complete, unhurried, willing to sit with difficult sentences until they had yielded what they contained. He wrote well. She had always known this, had heard it in the way he read to her during the years of her blindness, a voice that moved through language with natural ease. The letter used that ease without hiding behind it. He did not write to justify. He had said at the March meeting that he was done with justification, and the letter held to that. He wrote to say that he had been in the north long enough to see himself at a distance he had not previously managed, and that the view from that distance was not comfortable, but had been in some respects clarifying. He wrote that he understood now, in a way he had not fully understood, even in the London meeting, what the 10 years had actually been, not a series of protective decisions on her behalf, as he had long narrated it to himself, but 10 years of a woman's life, managed for someone else's comfort. He wrote that he did not expect forgiveness, and was not asking for it, and had come to believe that asking for it would be a continuation of the same habit, making his own need for relief the organizing principle of her response to him. He wrote near the end that he was thinking of remaining in the north for some time, that he had cousins there and work he could make himself useful in, and that Kingsley Manor was hers. He wrote the word without qualification, without the legal hedging that might have surrounded it, simply hers, and that whatever she chose to do with it was right. He wrote in the last paragraph, I cannot give you back the 10 years. I know this plainly, and I don't intend to say it the way men say things they cannot do in order to receive credit for the acknowledgement. I'm saying it because it is true, and because you deserve to have true things said to you without any expectation of what the saying costs me. You deserve that from the beginning. I'm sorry I understood it too late to give it to you when it would have mattered differently. She read the letter twice. Then she folded it carefully and put it in the writing room desk in the drawer beside the audit report and sat for a while in the morning quiet. She was going to write back. She knew this, had known it before she finished the first reading. Not because she owed him a response, not because anything in her required reconciliation for her own peace of mind, but because the letter was honest, and she had built her life in the 6 months since her sight returned, on the principle that honesty deserved acknowledgement when it arrived regardless of its origin. She was not going to forgive him today. She might eventually arrive at something in the neighborhood of forgiveness. Not for his sake, but for the sake of the 10 years, because carrying active unforgiveness through the rest of her life would mean giving him more of it than she was willing to give. But that was future work, and she was not going to rush it, and she was not going to perform it before it was real. She picked up her pen and wrote back 3 paragraphs. She told him she had received the letter and read it. She told him the portrait had been located and was expected to return to the manor by August. She told him that Clara Briggs was working out extremely well, and that the East Garden was being restored, and that the library was slowly being rebuilt, and that none of this was said to wound him, but simply because she found, as she had always found, that the honest condition of things was more useful to both parties than its management. She signed it with her name, her full name, Sarah Hartwell, Kingsley, the signature that someone had practiced and forged and used without permission, and folded it and sealed it herself. Thomas posted it that afternoon. The portrait came home in August. Fairfield had negotiated its return with the patience and precision that characterized everything he did, and it arrived on a Tuesday morning in a crate that Thomas and 2 hired men carried through the front doors with the careful ceremony of men transporting something they understood mattered. Mrs. Pemberton stood in the entrance hall and watched. Clara stood to one side with her ledger tucked under her arm, and her expression carefully composed around something that was not quite composure. They opened the crate in the entrance hall. Her grandfather looked out at her from the canvas, Edward Hartwell's father, whom she had never known, whom she knew only from this portrait and the stories her father told. A man with her father's eyes and her own jaw, and the expression of someone who had built things from the beginning and was not especially impressed by the fact of having done so, because building was simply what was required, and he had done what was required. She looked at him for a long time. Then she looked at Thomas and said, "Put it back." He and the 2 men lifted it between them and carried it to the entrance hall wall above the mantel and hung it at the same height. It had always hung because the hook was still there. The original hook which Oliver had never removed, and she had always thought that detail contained something important, though she had not been able to articulate what until now, standing in the entrance hall, watching her grandfather's portrait settle back into the space where it had always belonged. He had never removed the hook. She stood with this for a moment. The hook and what it meant that he had always known at some level that the portrait was supposed to be there. That there was a version of the story in which things were restored to where they belonged. That he had not even while he sold and concealed and managed entirely abandoned the idea that the right thing occupied its proper place. She did not know what to do with this. She filed it under the category of things she was going to hold without resolving. Because her life had taught her at some cost that the drive to resolve things quickly was not always the same as understanding them correctly. She looked up at her grandfather. "There," she said. Not to anyone in particular. To the entrance hall, to the house, to the 10 years and what they had cost, and what they had built, because they had built something she was clear enough to see that even now. They had built a woman who knew how to listen better than anyone she had encountered, who could read the quality of a pause and the specific shape of a lie, and the difference between genuine care and convenient management. They had built a woman who had chosen to see again rather than accept the comfortable dark, who had carried her secret sight like a held breath for 3 weeks and used it to dismantle a decade of careful fiction. She was not glad it had happened. She was never going to be glad it had happened. But she was what it had made her, and what it had made her was formidable, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. Clara came to stand beside her, looked up at the portrait. "He looks like someone who didn't put up with much." "He didn't," Sarah said. "It ran in the family." Clara's composure did this time produce a smile, brief and genuine. "The Jameson tenants are coming Thursday," Clara said, returning to business with the transition of a young woman who had learned that the most important conversations were the ones you had while your hands were already doing the next thing. "They want to discuss the eastern pasture lease terms, and Fairfield sent a note about the second parcel. The offer was accepted." Sarah turned from the portrait. "Good. Schedule the Jamesons for 10 in the morning, and write to Fairfield, ask him what we need from the new landowner in terms of existing tenant arrangements before the transfer is finalized. I don't want anyone on that land caught in the same position the Briggs family was caught in." "Already drafted," Clara said. She produced a sheet from the ledger. "I just needed your approval on the language." Sarah took it. "Read it." The language was good, direct, specific, exactly what she would have written herself if she'd been the one to draft it. She had known within 2 weeks of Clara's start that she had made the right offer. Clara was not an assistant in the ordinary sense of the word. She was a woman learning the same things Sarah was learning from a different angle, and they were building between them. Something that felt less like an employer and employee, and more like what it actually was. Two women who had both been affected by the same decade of mismanagement working together to fix it. "The language is fine," she said. "Send it." Clara tucked the paper back into the ledger and headed for the writing room, and Sarah turned back to the entrance hall to her grandfather's portrait, returned to its proper wall, to the hook that had always been there. In September, Oliver wrote again. Shorter this time, 2 paragraphs. He was doing well in the north. He had found work consulting on an agricultural improvement project which he had not expected to find meaningful, and did. He did not ask about the manner, which she appreciated. He said one thing directly, that he had been thinking about the night of the scream, and that he understood now why she had come to the stairs and held her ground and refused to be moved by his explanation, even before she had any evidence. He said, "You already knew before you had any way to prove it. I think you always knew. I think I depended on the fact that knowing without evidence was a place you couldn't act from. I was wrong about that too." She read this twice, then wrote back 4 paragraphs. The second parcel. The Jameson tenants. The portrait. Clara's competence. Then, in the 4th paragraph, she wrote, "You are right that I always knew. I think this is perhaps the most important thing I've learned in all of this. That knowing is not always the same as seeing, and seeing is not always the same as having proof, but the knowing is still real. I spent 10 years dismissing what I knew because I could not see to confirm it. I am not going to dismiss it again." She signed it Sarah. Just Sarah this time, without the full name, without the legal weight of it. She was not sure what that meant. She was not going to decide what it meant before she knew. The first frost came in October. She was in the East Garden when it arrived, the garden that had been overgrown and was now, after 3 months of supervised restoration, something between wild and order, still finding its shape, but alive and intentional, in the way that a thing is alive and intentional when it has been chosen rather than simply maintained. She was standing in the garden in the gray October morning, her cane in her hand from habit, her eyes open to everything around her, the restored structure beginning to show through the last of the late-season color. The specific quality of light that a frost-touched morning had, thin and clean, and without softness, when Clara came to the garden door. "Lady Fairchild is here," Clara said. "She didn't send ahead. I've put her in the drawing room." Lady Fairchild was the wife of the largest landowner in the county, a woman of 60 with strong opinions and the social authority to act on them. She had called twice since Sarah's return, and both calls had been the comfortable, exploratory kind of social visit. The calls of a woman taking the measure of someone she found interesting and hadn't decided yet what to do with. Sarah went inside. Lady Fairchild was standing in the drawing room, not sitting, standing, which was how she operated, always slightly in motion, as though sitting down committed her to a length of stay she was not willing to guarantee in advance. "I'll come to the point," Lady Fairchild said. She did not extend pleasantries which Sarah had come to appreciate about her. "There's a situation in the Mercer household. You may have heard." She had not heard, but she listened now with the complete attention she brought to everything. The situation in the Mercer household was this. The younger Mrs. Mercer, Eleanor Mercer, 26, recently married, had approached Lady Fairchild privately with concerns about the management of her husband's estate, specifically about financial decisions made without her knowledge, specifically about property that had been in her family. Lady Fairchild looked at Sarah across the drawing room with the expression of a woman who understood exactly why she was here and was not going to waste either of their time pretending she didn't. "She doesn't know where to start," Lady Fairchild said. She's frightened, and she's not certain what she's allowed to do, or what the law actually says about her position. She has no one she trusts who knows how to navigate this kind of situation. A pause. I told her I might know someone. Sarah stood very still for a moment. This was not what she had expected. Not today, not as the form this would take. She had known in a general way that the months ahead were going to require her to build something from what she had learned, that the woman who had come through the other side of this particular education had an obligation to do something useful with it. But she had imagined it as something internal, something about her own estate and her own life and her own clear-sighted management of both. She had not imagined it arriving at her door in the form of Eleanor Mercer, 26 years old and frightened and not certain what she was allowed to do. "Tell her to come Thursday," she said. "In the morning before the Jamesons. Clara will be here. She should stay for the whole conversation." Lady Fairchild nodded with the satisfaction of a woman whose instinct had been confirmed. "I thought you'd say yes." "Did you? You have the look," Lady Fairchild said, with the direct simplicity of a woman who had been reading people for 60 years and saw no reason to soften what she found. Of someone who learned something the hard way and isn't going to let it have been for nothing. Sarah met her eyes, held them. "No," she said quietly. "I'm not." Lady Fairchild left. Clara came in from the corridor. She had been within earshot because Sarah had never told her not to be, and they had both understood without discussing it that Clara's job required her to be within earshot of things that mattered. "Eleanor Mercer," Clara said, "Thursday morning. I want you to pull everything Fairfield gave us on the initial petition process, the documentation requirements, the trustee provisions, the forms we used. She'll need to understand what exists before she can decide what to do with it." Clara was already writing. Then she stopped and looked up and said something she had not said to Sarah before in 3 months of working together. Something outside the professional register. Something personal said, with the particular care of someone who understood it was a departure and was making it deliberately. "Lady Kingsley." She paused. "My father asked me to tell you something if I ever had the chance. He said he's sorry he didn't speak up sooner. When Alderman came to him, he's carried it." Sarah looked at her steadily. "Tell your father that a man who was deceived by a professional deceiver has nothing to apologize for. Tell him that what he kept, the document, the copy of the notice, was the thing that made the difference. Tell him that Edward Hartwell's land is coming home, and that he is part of the reason why." Clara held her gaze for a moment. Then she nodded the nod of someone receiving something they intend to carry carefully, and went back to the writing room. Sarah stood alone in the drawing room. She looked at her grandfather's portrait visible through the open door to the entrance hall. She looked at the brass candlesticks that were not her mother's, because her mother's had not yet been located, and might never be, and she was learning to hold the specific grief of things that could not be fully restored while still doing the work of restoring what could. She was 35 years old. She had been blind for 10 years and seeing for 7 months. She had recovered her father's name on a legal document and her grandfather's face on a wall and the first 2 parcels of Hartwell land, and she was going to spend the rest of her life, however much of it remained, seeing everything that was there to see, asking for what she was owed without apology, and making herself available to women who needed to know that the knowledge and the law were theirs too. She was going to have Eleanor Mercer in this house on Thursday morning, and she was going to sit across from a frightened young woman and tell her plainly and without softening, "You can see. You have always been able to see. You simply needed someone to confirm that what you were looking at was real." The October light moved through the windows. The portrait looked down from its proper wall. And Sarah Miller, the woman who had found the courage to see the truth when no one believed she could, who had carried her sight like a secret until she knew exactly what to do with it, straightened her back, lifted her chin, and walked forward into everything that came next. Not because the darkness was behind her, but because she had learned at the cost that such lessons require that the light was always hers to claim.